Hitler didn't storm the government, he was handed it, legally, by people who thought they could control him. They couldn't. And that exact mistake gets repeated over and over throughout modern history. Today, we're breaking down how some of history's most notorious dictators actually rose to power. And once you see the pattern, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Let's get into it. Let's start with the one everyone thinks they already know the story of, Adolf Hitler. Here's the thing people usually get wrong. Hitler didn't seize power through some dramatic military coup. He was appointed Chancellor of Germany completely legally in January of 1933 by the actual president of Germany at the time. Let that sink in for a second. The most infamous dictator in modern history got his start through a legitimate government appointment, not an invasion. So how did that happen? Germany in the early 1930s was an absolute mess. The country was still reeling from the aftermath of World War I, crushed under massive war reparations, and then the Great Depression hit and unemployment skyrocketed to catastrophic levels. People were scared, angry, and desperate for literally anyone who sounded confident and offered simple answers. Hitler and the Nazi Party built their entire early strategy around exploiting that fear, blaming Germany's problems on scapegoats, promising national restoration, and putting on an absolutely relentless propaganda campaign that made the Nazis feel like the only party actually offering solutions. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest party in the German parliament, though still without an outright majority. Conservative politicians around President Hindenburg actually thought they could control Hitler, using him as a figurehead while they pulled the real strings behind the scenes. This is a genuinely wild miscalculation that keeps showing up throughout history, and we're going to see this exact mistake repeated multiple times on this list. They handed him the chancellorship thinking they could manage him. They could not. Once in power, Hitler moved fast. In February of 1933, the German parliament building burned down under mysterious circumstances, and the Nazis immediately blamed communists, using the fire as justification to push through emergency decrees that suspended civil liberties and allowed for the arrest of political opponents without trial. Then, in March of 1933, the Enabling Act was passed, which let Hitler's government make laws without needing parliament's approval at all. Within just a few months of gaining legal power, Hitler had already dismantled the democratic system that put him there in the first place. Now, let's talk about someone who honestly influenced a huge chunk of Hitler's own playbook, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini actually rose to power over a decade before Hitler, and in a lot of ways, he wrote the manual that other fascist movements would later copy. Italy, after World War I, was dealing with serious economic instability, widespread unemployment, and growing fear of a communist uprising following the Russian Revolution. Mussolini positioned his fascist movement as the strong, aggressive alternative to communism, promising order and national pride. In October of 1922, Mussolini organized what's known as the March on Rome, where thousands of his armed supporters, called Blackshirts, marched toward the capital demanding he be given power. Now here's the part that often gets skipped over. Mussolini himself wasn't even at the front of that march. He stayed safely in Milan, ready to flee to Switzerland if things went badly. The King of Italy, terrified of a civil war breaking out and worried the military might not even side with the government, decided to simply hand Mussolini power instead of resisting. So Mussolini essentially bluffed his way into control of an entire country, and it worked because the people who could have stopped him decided giving in was easier than fighting back. Now let's move over to someone whose rise to power looked completely different. Joseph Stalin. Unlike Hitler and Mussolini, Stalin didn't come to power through elections or dramatic public displays. He rose through something way quieter and honestly way scarier, bureaucratic maneuvering. After the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, there was a power vacuum at the top of the Soviet Union, and several prominent Bolshevik leaders were considered far more likely successors than Stalin. But Stalin held a position that seemed boring and unimportant at the time, General Secretary of the Communist Party, a role primarily focused on internal party administration. Everyone underestimated how much actual power came with controlling appointments, internal party organization, and information flow. Stalin used this position to slowly place loyal allies into key positions throughout the government, while playing rival factions against each other, forming temporary alliances just long enough to eliminate one rival before turning on his former allies to eliminate the next. By the late 1920s, Stalin had systematically outmaneuvered every major rival, and he consolidated total control through a combination of forced collectivization, propaganda, and brutal political purges that eliminated anyone who might challenge his authority. The terrifying lesson from Stalin's rise is that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest one giving speeches, it's the quiet one controlling the paperwork. Speaking of quiet administrative power turning into total control, let's talk about Mao Zedong. Mao's rise involved decades of actual armed conflict, but the way he ultimately secured lasting power afterward follows some familiar patterns. During China's long civil war throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Mao built the Chinese Communist Party's strength primarily through rural peasant support, promising land redistribution, and an end to the extreme inequality that had defined life under previous rule. After Japan's defeat in World War II, the civil war between Mao's communists and the existing nationalist government resumed, and by 1949, Mao's forces had won decisively, leading to the founding of the People's Republic of China. But winning the war was really just the beginning. Once in power, Mao consolidated control through massive propaganda campaigns, land reform that eliminated the traditional landowning class as a political threat, and later, campaigns like the Cultural Revolution specifically designed to eliminate anyone within his own party who might challenge his authority, framing loyalty to Mao himself as inseparable from loyalty to the revolution as a whole. Now, let's talk about one of the more genuinely chaotic rises to power on this entire list: Idi Amin of Uganda. Amin started his path to power through the military, working his way up through the ranks of the Ugandan army, eventually becoming its commander. In January of 1971, while the country's actual president was out of the country at an international summit, Amin simply seized control in a military coup. Initially, a lot of Ugandans were actually relieved, since the previous government had become increasingly unpopular and authoritarian. Amin cleverly presented himself early on as a more approachable, populist leader, which helped him gain public support in the immediate aftermath of the coup. But this initial goodwill evaporated fast as Amin consolidated brutal control, eliminating political rivals and anyone he perceived as a threat within the military itself. Amin's rise is a pretty clean example of a pattern we'll keep seeing, exploiting a specific moment of vulnerability or absence at the very top of a government's power structure. Let's jump over to someone whose rise combined military background with a family political legacy: Kim Il-sung of North Korea. After Japan's occupation of Korea ended following World War II, the Korean peninsula was divided between Soviet and American occupation zones. The Soviets specifically selected Kim, who had built some credibility fighting against Japanese occupation, to lead the Northern administration, believing he would be a reliable and controllable ally. Kim consolidated power throughout the late 1940s by systematically eliminating rival political factions within the North Korean Communist movement, while building an intense personality cult that framed him not just as a political leader, but as an almost divine father figure to the entire nation. This cult of personality strategy proved so effective at maintaining control that it's been passed down through 3 generations of his family, an approach very few other dictatorships in history have managed to replicate successfully. Now let's talk about Franco of Spain, whose path to power came through outright civil war. In 1936, a group of military generals, including Franco, launched a coup attempt against Spain's existing democratically elected government. When the coup failed to immediately succeed, it triggered a brutal, prolonged civil war that lasted 3 years, with Franco eventually emerging as the leader of the nationalist faction, receiving significant military support from both Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy in the process. After the nationalists won the Civil War in 1939, Franco ruled Spain as dictator for the following 36 years. What's notable about Franco compared to some others on this list is how he managed to survive politically for so long by remaining strategically flexible, staying officially neutral during World War II despite his fascist allies losing, and later positioning Spain as a reliable anti-communist ally to the United States during the Cold War, which helped keep his regime internationally tolerated for decades longer than it probably otherwise would have been. Let's talk about Saddam Hussein of Iraq now, whose rise to power is honestly a masterclass in patient political infiltration. Saddam joined Iraq's Ba'ath Party as a young man and steadily worked his way up through the party's internal structure over roughly 2 decades. The Ba'ath Party itself came to power through a coup in 1968, and Saddam, though officially the vice president at the time, gradually became the party's most powerful and feared figure by controlling internal security and intelligence operations. In 1979, Saddam formally became president, and in a chilling demonstration of exactly how far he was willing to go to secure his position, he called a meeting of top Ba'ath Party officials and had names read aloud of alleged conspirators, who were then immediately removed from the room and executed, while the remaining officials were forced to applaud. This single event, sometimes referred to as a purge disguised as a party meeting, instantly eliminated any potential internal rivals while sending an unmistakable message about the consequences of disloyalty. Now, let's look at Pol Pot of Cambodia, whose rise combined ideological extremism with brutal military strategy. Pol Pot led the Khmer Rouge movement, which gained significant strength partly because of instability caused by the wider conflict in Vietnam spilling across Cambodia's borders during the 1970s. As Cambodia's government grew weaker and increasingly unpopular, the Khmer Rouge's rural guerrilla forces gradually expanded their control across the countryside. In April of 1975, Khmer Rouge forces captured Cambodia's capital, and Pol Pot's radical vision quickly consolidated into totalitarian control. What's particularly notable about Pol Pot's approach to maintaining power is the sheer speed and totality of his attempt to reshape society, evacuating entire cities and eliminating anyone associated with the previous government, education system, or even basic professional class, viewing them as potential threats to his ideological vision. It's a genuinely extreme example of just how fast a power vacuum combined with an armed, organized ideological movement can spiral into total authoritarian control. Now let's talk about Augusto Pinochet of Chile, because this one involves some very direct foreign involvement that's honestly still debated today. In September of 1973, Pinochet, then the head of Chile's military, led a coup against Chile's democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende, who died during the attack on the presidential palace. The coup itself received documented support and encouragement from the United States government, deeply concerned about a socialist government existing in the Western Hemisphere during the height of the Cold War. Once in power, Pinochet dissolved the National Congress, banned political parties, and ruled through a military junta for the next 17 years, using a secret police force to systematically target, imprison, and often kill anyone suspected of leftist political sympathies. What makes Pinochet's rise particularly notable is how he framed his takeover as necessary economic salvation, implementing radical free market economic reforms that some Western governments praised even while ignoring the brutal human rights abuses happening simultaneously, an uncomfortable pattern that shows up more than once on this list. Let's jump over to Romania now, and Nicolae Ceaușescu, because his rise is a genuinely fascinating example of someone who initially seemed like a reformer before revealing his true intentions. Ceaușescu became the leader of Romania's Communist Party in 1965, and in his early years, he actually gained significant popularity, both domestically and internationally, by publicly distancing Romania from Soviet foreign policy, most notably by refusing to participate in the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. This early reputation as an independent-minded reformer earned Ceaușescu genuine goodwill from Western governments, who saw him as a useful crack in Soviet unity. But behind this carefully managed public image, Ceaușescu was steadily building one of the most extreme personality cults and repressive internal security states in the entire Eastern Bloc, using a secret police force to monitor and suppress the population, while pursuing increasingly disastrous economic policies that plunged the country into severe shortages and poverty, all while he built himself an enormous, absurdly extravagant palace. Ceaușescu's rise shows just how effectively a leader can manipulate international perception while building something completely different behind closed doors. Now let's talk about Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, whose rise came through a strikingly quiet, almost bloodless coup. In September of 1969, a group of young military officers led by Gaddafi, then just 27 years old, overthrew Libya's monarchy while the king was out of the country receiving medical treatment. The coup succeeded with minimal violence and surprisingly broad public support, since the monarchy had become increasingly viewed as corrupt and disconnected from ordinary Libyans, many of whom were frustrated that the country's substantial oil wealth wasn't reaching regular citizens. Gaddafi initially built genuine popularity through nationalizing the oil industry and redirecting revenue toward public services, housing, and infrastructure. But as with several others on this list, initial popularity gradually transformed into total, unchallenged authoritarian control, with Gaddafi eliminating political rivals, banning political parties entirely, and ruling Libya for over 4 decades through a uniquely personalized system of governance that existed almost entirely outside of any formal state institutions, making the entire country's political structure functionally inseparable from Gaddafi himself. Let's talk about Mobutu Sese Seko of what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, because his rise involves some very direct outside interference that doesn't always get discussed. Mobutu came to power through a military coup in 1965, but here's the part that's genuinely wild. His rise was heavily supported by Western governments, particularly the United States, specifically because of Cold War politics. Mobutu positioned himself as staunchly anti-communist, which made Western powers willing to overlook his authoritarian tendencies in exchange for a reliable ally in a strategically important region. Mobutu ruled for over 3 decades, systematically looting the country's vast natural resource wealth for personal gain while maintaining power through a combination of patronage networks, brutal suppression of dissent, and continued international support that lasted for decades longer than his domestic popularity ever would have allowed on its own. Mobutu's rise is honestly one of the clearest examples on this entire list of how much international backing can prop up a dictator whose actual domestic support is shaky at best. Now let's talk about a slightly different flavor of rise to power, Hugo Chávez of Venezuela, because his path started with an outright failed coup attempt. In 1992, Chávez, then a military officer, led a coup attempt against Venezuela's government that ultimately failed, resulting in his imprisonment. But here's the twist. Chávez's brief televised surrender speech, where he took responsibility for the coup's failure, oddly enough made him wildly popular with everyday Venezuelans who were frustrated with the existing political establishment and corruption. After serving a couple years in prison, Chávez was released and pivoted entirely to electoral politics, winning the presidency legitimately through the ballot box in 1998, campaigning heavily on anti-establishment and anti-poverty rhetoric. Once in office, Chávez gradually consolidated power through a series of constitutional changes, weakening independent institutions and reshaping the media landscape in his favor, slowly eroding the very democratic system that had legitimately put him in power in the first place. It's a genuinely unique example of someone whose failed authoritarian power grab actually became the foundation for gaining legitimate power through completely different means years later. So when you look at all of these rises to power side by side, some pretty clear patterns start showing up. Sometimes it's about exploiting genuine economic desperation and fear, like Hitler and Mussolini both did in the aftermath of massive economic crises. Sometimes it's about being underestimated entirely, quietly consolidating administrative power while everyone assumes someone louder is the real threat, like Stalin. Sometimes it's about exploiting a very specific and narrow window of vulnerability at the top of an existing government, like Idi Amin and Gaddafi both seizing power the exact moment the existing leader was out of the country. Sometimes outside powers actively prop up or even directly assist a dictator for their own strategic interests, like Mobutu and Pinochet both receiving Western support specifically because of Cold War politics. Sometimes it's about carefully managing international perception while building something completely different behind closed doors, like Ceaușescu's early reputation as a reformer. And sometimes, like with Chávez, even a failed attempt at seizing power illegally can somehow become the foundation for gaining legitimate power through completely different means entirely. What's genuinely unsettling about all of this is that almost none of these men rose to power purely through brute force alone. Nearly every single one of them needed willing collaborators along the way, politicians who thought they could control them, frightened populations desperate for simple answers during moments of genuine crisis, or foreign governments willing to look the other way in exchange for strategic advantage. The tanks and the soldiers usually came after power was already mostly secured, not before, which honestly raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If the conditions that created every single dictator on this list, economic desperation, fear, division, distrust in existing institutions, keep showing up again and again throughout history, what exactly makes anyone think we're permanently immune to it happening again somewhere new? Anyway, that's how some of history's most notorious dictators actually rose to power. Let me know which one you want a full deep dive on. No cap, that's the file. Catch you next time.